The morning sun was barely up when Daniel stepped off the bus at Riverside Academy of Fine Arts. His backpack felt heavier than usual, not because of the art supplies inside, but because of everything this moment meant. This was one of the most prestigious art schools in the country, and somehow he'd made it here. Daniel had always loved painting. From the time he was 7 years old, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table with a cheap watercolor set, he knew this was what he wanted to do with his life. Over the years, he'd practiced constantly, learning everything he could from library books, online tutorials, and the occasional community center workshop. By the time he turned 17, his work had caught the attention of some people who really mattered in the art world. He'd even won a major national award for young artists. But standing here now, looking at the pristine white buildings and perfectly manicured lawns of Riverside Academy, he felt like maybe he didn't quite belong. The studios were everything he'd imagined. High ceilings, huge windows letting in natural light, and the smell of oil paint and turpentine hanging in the air. Other students were already setting up their easels, chatting easily with each other like they'd known each other forever. Most of them probably had. Daniel noticed he was one of maybe 3 black students in the entire room. He'd expected that, but it still felt isolating. "Everyone find a seat," a voice called out from the front of the room. Professor Edward Hartley stood there, tall and thin, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a paint-stained smock over an expensive-looking shirt. Everything about him screamed old money and tradition. "Welcome to Advanced Painting Techniques. I've been teaching at this institution for 27 years, and I pride myself on maintaining the highest standards of classical artistry." Daniel slid into a seat near the middle of the room, trying not to draw attention to himself. He just wanted to learn, to absorb everything this place had to offer. Professor Hartley began walking around the room, looking at each student as he passed. When he got to Daniel, he paused. The pause lasted just a second too long. "And you are?" "Daniel Rodriguez, sir." "Rodriguez." The professor's eyebrow raised slightly. "Interesting. I wasn't aware we had any Rodriguez on our roster this semester." "It's Rodriguez Johnson, sir. My mom's side is Rodriguez, my dad's side is Johnson." "I see." Professor Hartley's expression was hard to read. "Well, Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, I hope you're prepared for the rigor of this course. We've been accepting more diversity admissions lately, which is wonderful, of course, but the standards remain the same. Tell me, do you have any formal training?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt every eye in the room turned toward him. "I've been painting for 12 years, sir. Mostly self-taught, but I've taken workshops and..." "Self-taught." Professor Hartley nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "That's admirable, truly. But you'll find that intuitive, casual approaches to art don't translate well in serious academic settings. We focus on technique here, proper technique. The fundamentals that separate hobbyists from true artists." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand, sir. That's why I'm here, to learn." "Good, good." The professor moved on to the next student, a blonde girl who looked like she'd stepped out of a country club brochure. "And Miss Patterson, I see your mother studied here in the 80s. Wonderful legacy. I'm sure you've inherited her eye for composition." The girl beamed. "Thank you, Professor. I hope so." The rest of the class introduction continued, but Daniel barely heard it. His mind was still stuck on that exchange, on the way Professor Hartley had said diversity admissions like it was something shameful, on the assumption that being self-taught meant being inferior. After the introductions, Professor Hartley unveiled their first assignment. A classical still life, a bowl of fruit, a wine bottle, and a white cloth draped across a table. Nothing fancy, nothing creative, just pure technical execution. "I want to see your understanding of light, shadow, perspective, and color theory," Professor Hartley explained. "No abstractions, no interpretations, no hiding behind modern artistic license. Just skill, pure skill. This will show me exactly where each of you stands." He looked directly at Daniel when he said that last part. Over the next week, Daniel worked on his still life painting with the same dedication he brought to everything. He arrived at the studio early and stayed late. He mixed his colors carefully, studying the way light hit the curved surface of the apple, the way the glass bottle created subtle reflections on the white cloth. But he couldn't help adding his own touch. He shifted the perspective slightly, making the viewer feel like they were leaning in close, intimate with the scene. He played with the temperature of the shadows, making them warmer than they appeared in real life, creating an emotional undertone that a straightforward representation wouldn't have. When critique day arrived, Daniel felt confident about his work. He'd followed all the technical requirements while still maintaining his artistic voice. That was the balance, wasn't it? Respecting tradition while bringing something new? Professor Hartley went through each student's painting, offering detailed feedback. He praised Ms. Patterson's elegant brushwork and Mr. Chen's sophisticated understanding of atmospheric perspective. When he got to Daniel's easel, he stopped and stared at it for a long moment. Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson. His voice was cold. Can you explain to me what you were thinking here? Sir, I followed the assignment. The composition, the lighting, you altered the perspective. The assignment was to paint what you see, not what you imagine it should be. I understand, sir, but I thought showing the scene from this angle created more visual interest while still demonstrating. You thought. Professor Hartley turned to address the entire class. This is a perfect example of what happens when students try to run before they can walk. Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson has taken what should be a straightforward technical exercise and turned it into something that, frankly, looks amateurish. The shadows are wrong. The color temperature is inconsistent with the actual lighting, and the perspective shift serves no purpose except to distract from these fundamental failures. Daniel felt heat rising in his face. Around him, other students shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to defend his work, to explain his choices, but the words stuck in his throat. I'll be generous and give you a C-, Professor Hartley continued, but I strongly suggest you focus on mastering the basics before attempting any creative flourishes. Technique first. Always technique first. As the other students filed out after class, Daniel stood alone at his easel, staring at his painting. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't a C- either. He knew that much. The shadows weren't wrong. They were interpreted. The perspective shift wasn't a distraction. It was a choice. But apparently his choices didn't matter here. A fellow student lingered by the door, a girl with dark hair and concerned eyes.
Hey, she said quietly.
That was harsh. Your painting is really good, actually. Daniel managed a small smile. Thanks, I'm Maya, by the way. And just so you know, Professor Hartley praised my painting for doing basically the same thing with the color temperature that he criticized you for. Daniel looked at her, surprised. Maya shrugged. Just thought you should know. It's not about the work. Not really. After she left, Daniel packed up his supplies slowly. He'd known this wouldn't be easy. He'd prepared himself for the challenge of a rigorous academic program. But he hadn't prepared himself for this, for having his work dismissed before it was truly seen. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He'd worked too hard to get here, sacrificed too much. If Professor Hartley wanted to see technique, Daniel would show him technique. He'd prove that he belonged here, even if he had to do it one painting at a time. What Professor Hartley didn't know, what Daniel had chosen not to advertise, was that his self-taught work had already been displayed in galleries. That his interpretation of light and shadow had earned him recognition from critics who actually understood what he was trying to do. But Daniel believed in letting his work speak for itself. He just hadn't expected it to be speaking to someone who'd already decided not to listen. 3 weeks into the semester, and Daniel had developed a routine. He arrived at the studio before anyone else, sometimes even before the janitor had finished cleaning. He'd spend those quiet morning hours working on his technique, practicing the classical methods that Professor Hartley seemed to worship. Still lifes, portraits from photographs, studies of drapery and light. All the fundamentals, but the critique sessions kept getting worse. Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson, your brushwork is sloppy here, Professor Hartley would say, pointing at a section of canvas that Daniel had deliberately left loose and expressive. When Maya used the exact same technique in her work, the professor called it confidently loose and showing artistic maturity. Your color choices are muddy, he'd criticize, even when Daniel had carefully mixed complementary colors to create subtle, sophisticated tones. But when another student, a guy named Trevor, whose dad apparently donated a new wing to the school, created actual muddy colors by overmixing his paint, Professor Hartley called it earthy and grounded. It was exhausting. Not the work itself, but the constant feeling of fighting an invisible battle. Daniel would paint something he was genuinely proud of, something that showed both technical skill and creative vision, and Professor Hartley would find a way to tear it down. Always in front of the entire class, always with that same tone of disappointed patience, like Daniel was a child who kept making the same obvious mistakes. "I don't get it," Maya said one afternoon as they cleaned their brushes together. "Your work is incredible. I've learned more watching you paint than I have from half of Hartley's lectures." Daniel shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother him. "Maybe I'm just not getting it. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Or maybe he's just being unfair." Maya lowered her voice even though they were alone in the studio. "You've noticed he only does this to you, right? And to Carlos, that other guy in our Tuesday class. But everyone else? He's either neutral or encouraging." "Yeah, I've noticed." Daniel had more than noticed. He'd spent sleepless nights thinking about it, wondering if he was being too sensitive, if he was imagining things. But hearing Maya confirm it made something settle in his chest. At least he wasn't crazy. The next assignment was a self-portrait. Professor Hartley explained that self-portraits were the ultimate test of an artist's skill because they required both technical precision and emotional honesty. "You cannot hide from yourself," he said, pacing at the front of the classroom. "Every weakness in your technique will be magnified. Every shortcut will be obvious." He looked directly at Daniel when he said that last part. Daniel decided to paint himself the way he felt in that classroom, sitting at an easel, surrounded by shadows but with light coming from his canvas illuminating his face. It was symbolic, sure, but it was also technically challenging. The light source was complex, the shadows required careful attention, and the composition told a story. He worked on it for 2 weeks straight. He studied his own face in mirrors, took reference photos from different angles, mixed and remixed his skin tones until they were perfect. He painted the texture of his hair, each individual lock, the way they caught the light. He captured the determination in his eyes, but also the exhaustion, the hope mixed with frustration. When it was done, Daniel knew it was the best thing he'd ever created. It wasn't just technically proficient, it was alive. It was real. Critique day arrived, and Daniel set up his self-portrait on the easel with a mixture of pride and dread. He watched as Professor Hartley examined the other students' work first. He praised Trevor's self-portrait, even though the proportions were off and the colors looked flat. He complimented a girl named Ashley on her brave choice to paint herself crying, even though the tears looked like someone had glued pieces of plastic to her face. Then he got to Daniel's easel. The professor stood there for a long time just looking. Daniel's heart pounded. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment when Professor Hartley would finally see what Daniel could do. Maybe all those harsh critiques had been pushing him toward this moment of recognition. "Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson." Professor Hartley's voice cut through the silence. "This is extremely disappointing." Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Sir? You were given a straightforward assignment. Paint a self-portrait. Instead, you've created this theatrical scene. Why are you at an easel? Why is the light source coming from the canvas? This isn't a self-portrait. It's a performance." "But I am painting myself," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's me, that's what I look like. That's you hiding behind a concept because you lack the technical skill to create a proper portrait." Professor Hartley turned to address the class. "Notice how the light source, while creative, allows the artist to obscure much of the facial detail and shadow. Notice how the focus on the easel distracts from the face itself. These are tricks, ladies and gentlemen. And tricks are what artists use when they cannot master the fundamentals." "The shadows aren't obscuring anything," Daniel said, his frustration finally breaking through. "They're part of the composition. The light and dark represent—" "I know what they represent," Professor Hartley interrupted. "I've seen hundreds of students try to mask technical deficiency behind symbolism and metaphor. It's not original, Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson, and it's not impressive. With all due respect, sir, the technique is solid. The proportions are accurate. The lighting is consistent with the source, the skin tones. Are you arguing with me?" Professor Hartley's eyes went cold. "Are you, a first-semester student, arguing with someone who has been teaching art at the highest level for nearly 3 decades? The room went completely silent. Daniel could feel everyone watching him, waiting to see what he'd do. Part of him wanted to back down, to apologize, to just take whatever grade the professor gave him and move on. But another part of him, the part that had spent years fighting to be taken seriously as an artist, couldn't let it go. "I'm not arguing, sir. I'm trying to understand your critique. You said the technique is deficient, but you haven't explained specifically what's wrong with it. The anatomy is correct. The values are properly distributed. The edges are handled with variation to create depth. I followed every principle you taught us." Professor Hartley's face flushed red. "Your grade is a D, and if you continue to waste class time with these defensive displays, it will be lower. Now sit down." Daniel sat, his hands shaking with anger and humiliation. Around him, he could see other students looking away, embarrassed for him, or maybe embarrassed by the professor's behavior. Maya caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic look. After class, several students came up to him. Maya was first. "That was completely unfair. Your painting is amazing." "Seriously," said Carlos, the other student Professor Hartley regularly targeted. "I've been in his classes for 2 semesters now, and this is what he does. He picks someone and just goes after them all semester." A few other students nodded in agreement, but no one wanted to say too much. Professor Hartley had a reputation for being vindictive. Cross him, and your grades would suffer. Your recommendations would be lukewarm. Your opportunities at the school would mysteriously dry up. That evening, Daniel sat in his tiny dorm room, staring at his self-portrait leaning against the wall. Was he wrong? Was he missing something obvious that everyone else could see? He pulled out his laptop and looked up the rubric for the assignment. He'd met every single requirement. More than met them. He'd exceeded them. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his grandmother. "How's my famous artist doing? Missing you out here." Famous artist. Daniel almost laughed. He thought about telling her what was happening, about Professor Hartley's constant criticism and today's humiliation, but she'd worked double shifts at the hospital for years to help support his dream. She'd been so proud when he got accepted to Riverside Academy. He couldn't worry her now. "Doing great, Grandma. Learning a lot. Miss you too." He put his phone down and looked at his calendar. The semester was only half over. He had months more of this ahead of him. The thought made him tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. But then he looked at his self-portrait again, really looked at it. It was good. He knew it was good. Professor Hartley's opinion didn't change that objective truth. The light worked. The composition worked. The emotion was there. Daniel made a decision then. He'd keep doing his best work. He'd keep learning everything he could, even if it wasn't from Professor Hartley's lectures. He'd prove himself through his art, not through arguments or confrontations. Because at the end of the day, the work was what mattered. What he didn't know was that someone else had noticed what was happening. Professor Lisa Martinez taught in the sculpture department, but her studio was down the hall from Hartley's painting class. She'd walked by during critique sessions. She'd heard the harsh tone, seen the way certain students were treated differently than others, and she'd started paying attention. The next week, Professor Hartley announced a major assignment. The entire class would be working toward the spring student exhibition, the biggest event of the academic year. A panel of faculty members would select the best pieces to be displayed in the main gallery. It was a huge opportunity. Pieces in the spring exhibition got seen by gallery owners, collectors, and art critics from across the region. "This is your chance to prove yourselves," Professor Hartley said, "to show whether you belong at this institution or whether you've simply been coasting on potential and luck." Once again, his eyes found Daniel in the crowd. The theme is legacy. "I want to see work that demonstrates not just technical skill, but an understanding of art history and your place within it. This is not an opportunity for experimental nonsense or trendy political statements. This is about showing respect for the tradition of fine art while contributing something meaningful to it." Daniel listened carefully, his mind already working. Legacy. He thought about his grandmother, about his parents, about all the people who'd sacrificed so he could be here. He thought about the artists who'd inspired him. many of them people of color whose work had been ignored or dismissed by the mainstream art world for decades. He knew exactly what he wanted to paint, and he knew Professor Hartley was going to hate it. But for the first time since starting at Riverside Academy, Daniel didn't care. He wasn't painting for Professor Hartley anymore. He was painting for himself, for his family, for every artist who'd been told they didn't belong. If that meant another bad grade, so be it. Some things were more important than grades. Daniel spent the next 3 weeks working on his legacy painting like his life depended on it. He chose to create a large portrait that blended classical Renaissance techniques with contemporary themes. The central figure was a young black man, dressed in modern clothes but posed like the subjects in old Dutch master paintings. Behind him, fading into the shadows, were the faces of historical black artists, their presence both haunting and inspiring. The technical challenge was enormous. He used the chiaroscuro method, the dramatic contrast between light and dark that Caravaggio had made famous 400 years ago. But he applied it to a subject that those old masters would never have painted with such dignity and prominence. Every brushstroke was deliberate, every value carefully calculated. This wasn't just art. It was a statement and a technical demonstration rolled into one. Professor Hartley circled Daniel's easel during studio time like a shark circling prey. "Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, are you certain this is the direction you want to go? The exhibition panel will be looking for sophisticated work, not social commentary disguised as painting." "It is sophisticated work, sir," Daniel replied, not looking up from his canvas. "I'm using the same techniques as the Renaissance masters, the same principles of composition and light that you've taught us." "The techniques are adequate," Professor Hartley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But the subject matter is divisive. Art should be universal, not political." Maya, working at the next easel, spoke up without thinking. "Sir, wasn't most Renaissance art political? Commissioned by powerful families to project their status and authority?" Professor Hartley's jaw tightened. "That's different, Ms. Chen. That was about beauty and aspiration. This," he gestured at Daniel's painting, "is about making people uncomfortable." "Maybe art should make people uncomfortable sometimes," Daniel said quietly. "Maybe that's part of its purpose." The professor's face flushed. "I'm trying to help you, Mr. Rodriguez Johnson, but if you insist on being stubborn, don't be surprised when your work is rejected by the exhibition panel. I'm on that panel, as are 3 other instructors who value traditional excellence over trendy provocations." After he walked away, Maya leaned over. "He's going to tank your chances at the exhibition." "I know," Daniel said, "but I can't paint what he wants me to paint." "I won't." The truth was, this painting meant everything to Daniel. It was personal in a way his other work hadn't been. He'd titled it Inheritance, and every element was carefully chosen. The young man's hands positioned in a gesture of both receiving and giving. The way the historical artists in the background seemed to be watching, approving, passing something forward. The rich colors emerging from darkness into light. It was the best thing he'd ever created, and he knew it. 2 days before the exhibition panel review, Daniel stayed late in the studio. The building was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of someone practicing piano in the music wing. He was adding final details, tiny highlights that most people wouldn't even notice, but that made the painting feel alive. He was so focused that he didn't hear the door open. "That's remarkable." Daniel jumped, nearly dropping his brush. Professor Lisa Martinez stood in the doorway, her arms crossed but her expression warm. He'd seen her around the building but never had a class with her. "Thank you," he said. Unsure of what else to say, she walked closer, studying the painting with the kind of attention that Daniel had craved from Professor Hartley all semester. "The technique is excellent. Really excellent. The way you've handled the transition between the light and shadow here," she pointed at the central figure's face. "That's master-level work. How long have you been painting?" "Since I was 7. Seriously, I mean, I've been taking it seriously." "It shows." Professor Martinez looked at him thoughtfully. "I've heard your critiques in Hartley's class. I have the studio down the hall." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Oh, I want you to know that what I've heard doesn't reflect the quality of what I'm seeing in front of me. This painting demonstrates exceptional skill and artistic maturity. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "Professor Hartley is on the exhibition panel," Daniel said, unable to keep the bitterness out of his voice. I know. So am I, she smiled. Keep doing what you're doing. Your work speaks for itself. After she left, Daniel stood there for a long moment, just breathing. Someone saw it. Someone understood. That had to count for something. The day of the panel review arrived. All the advanced painting students set up their pieces in the main critique gallery. The exhibition panel would walk through, discuss each piece, and select the ones that would be featured in the spring show. Getting selected was a huge deal. It meant gallery exposure, potential sales, and a serious boost to your reputation as an emerging artist. Daniel set up Inheritance on his assigned easel. Around him, other students were doing the same. Trevor had painted a landscape that looked like a slightly worse version of a Bob Ross tutorial. Ashley had created an abstract piece that was honestly pretty good. Maya's work was a stunning portrait of her grandmother that used light in ways that made Daniel wish he'd thought of it. The panel arrived. 5 professors, including Professor Hartley and Professor Martinez. They moved through the room systematically, spending a few minutes at each easel. Daniel watched them approach, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Professor Hartley reached Inheritance first. His expression was unreadable. The other panel members gathered around, and for a long moment no one spoke. The technique is strong, said Professor Williams from the drawing department. Very strong, actually. Look at the modeling of the face, the way the light wraps around the form. The composition is sophisticated, added Professor Martinez. And the historical references show real knowledge of art history. Professor Hartley cleared his throat. While the technical execution is adequate, I have concerns about the subject matter. It's overtly political. The spring exhibition should showcase work that represents the best of traditional fine art, not social commentary. All art is political, Edward, Professor Martinez said calmly. The question is whether it's well executed. And I disagree. The student has chosen to prioritize message over mastery. Look at the background figures, they're deliberately loose and unfinished. They're meant to be fading into the past, Professor Williams interjected. It's an artistic choice, not a technical failure. And it's effective. Daniel stood there, feeling like a spectator at a debate about someone else's work. He wanted to defend his painting, to explain his choices, but students weren't allowed to speak during panel reviews. Professor Hartley's voice took on an edge. In my 27 years of teaching, I've seen countless students try to use political themes to compensate for technical weaknesses. This is another example of that pattern. With respect, Edward, I don't see any technical weaknesses here. Professor Martinez stood her ground. The anatomy is correct. The values are properly distributed. The paint handling shows control and confidence. What specific technical failure are you seeing? The other panel members were watching this exchange with uncomfortable expressions. Apparently, disagreements like this weren't common. Professor Hartley's face was red now. The student has been problematic all semester. Argumentative, resistant to feedback, unwilling to follow instructions. This painting represents that same attitude of believing he knows better than his instructors. Or, Professor Martinez said, her voice cool and professional, it represents a talented student developing his own artistic voice, which is exactly what we should be encouraging. An uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, Professor Chen from the watercolor department spoke up. Should we vote? They voted. 3-2 in favor of including Inheritance in the exhibition. Professor Hartley's expression was thunderous. He wrote something on his clipboard with sharp, angry strokes. As the panel moved to the next easel, Professor Martinez caught Daniel's eye and gave him the smallest nod. He'd made it. Despite everything, his work would be in the spring exhibition, but the victory felt hollow because he knew what it meant. Professor Hartley wouldn't forgive this. The fact that Daniel's painting had been selected despite his objections would be seen as a personal insult. The rest of the semester was going to be even worse. That evening, Daniel called his grandmother. "Grandma, my painting got selected for the spring exhibition." Her squeal of joy was so loud he had to hold the phone away from his ear. "Baby, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. I knew you could do it." He smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Thanks, Grandma. It was touch and go for a while, but it worked out. Of course it worked out. You're talented. You work hard. That's all that matters." If only that were true, Daniel thought. But he didn't say it out loud. Let her have this moment of pure pride. He could carry the complicated parts alone. The next day's class was tense. Professor Hartley didn't mention the exhibition results. Instead, he launched into a lecture about artistic integrity and the difference between genuine innovation and attention-seeking gimmicks. Every word felt aimed directly at Daniel. Some students confuse controversy with creativity, Professor Hartley said, pacing at the front of the room. They think that making people uncomfortable equals making meaningful art. But true artistry transcends cheap emotional manipulation. It speaks to universal human experiences through technical excellence. Maya raised her hand. Sir, couldn't you argue that challenging people's comfort zones is a universal human experience? Throughout history, the most important art has been work that pushed boundaries and made people reconsider their assumptions. Professor Hartley's eyes narrowed. Ms. Chen, when you've studied art history as long as I have, you'll understand the difference between genuine boundary-pushing work and mere provocation. But sir, that's enough. His voice was sharp. Unless you'd like to join Mr. Rodriguez-Johnson in struggling with your grades this semester. Maya closed her mouth, but she looked furious. The class continued, but the atmosphere was poisonous. Other students kept their heads down, afraid to draw Professor Hartley's attention. Daniel tried to focus on his work, but it was impossible. Every time the professor walked past his easel, he felt a wave of hostility that was almost physical. This couldn't continue for the rest of the semester. Something had to change. Daniel just didn't know what or how. What he didn't know was that Professor Martinez had already started asking questions. She'd pulled up Daniel's portfolio from his admission application. She'd looked at his work from before Riverside Academy. And what she'd found had shocked her so much that she'd scheduled a meeting with the dean of students. Because Daniel Rodriguez-Johnson wasn't just a talented student who was being treated unfairly. He was someone whose work had already been recognized at the highest levels of the art world. Someone who had accomplished things that most students at Riverside could only dream of. And Professor Hartley had no idea who he was really dealing with. The spring exhibition was 3 weeks away, and Daniel's painting was going to be seen by hundreds of people. Gallery owners, art critics, collectors, people who actually knew the contemporary art world. People who might recognize his work and his name. Daniel kept painting, kept showing up to class, kept absorbing Professor Hartley's criticisms with as much grace as he could manage. He had no idea that everything was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly predict. Sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, whether you want it to or not. And sometimes the people who've been trying to keep you small are about to find out exactly how wrong they've been. The spring exhibition was scheduled for a Friday evening in late April. For 2 weeks before the opening, the selected student works were displayed in the main gallery for the campus community to view. Daniel walked past his painting every day on the way to class, still not quite believing it was really there, hanging on the same walls where famous artists had exhibited over the school's 100-year history. Other students stopped to look at Inheritance regularly. Some spent a long time studying it. Some took photos. Daniel overheard whispered conversations, people debating the meaning, discussing the technique. It felt surreal. Professor Hartley walked past it every day too, but he never stopped. Never looked at it. Just kept walking like it wasn't there. In class, things had gone from bad to worse. Daniel's grades were suffering despite the quality of his work. A still life that Maya said was museum quality got a C. A figure drawing that took him 40 hours received a D with a note about fundamental proportional errors that didn't actually exist. Professor Hartley was making his disapproval clear in the only way he could, now that the painting was already in the exhibition. Just get through the semester, Maya told him one afternoon as they walked across campus. After this, you never have to take another class with him. I know, Daniel said, but it's not just about me. He'll do this to the next student and the next one. Someone needs to say something. Professor Martinez is saying something. I heard she filed a formal complaint with the dean. Daniel looked at her in surprise. Really? Really? My roommate works in the admin office. She said there's a whole investigation happening. Martinez brought evidence, examples of different students getting different grades for the same quality of work, recordings of critique sessions. Maya lowered her voice. Apparently you're not the first student Hartley's done this to. She found 3 other cases from the past 5 years. Daniel didn't know how to feel about that. Relieved that someone was taking action, angry that this had been going on for years, guilty that other students had suffered through what he was experiencing. The day of the exhibition opening arrived. Daniel's grandmother had taken the bus from 3 states away to be there. His mom and stepdad drove up that morning. They were so proud, so excited. He tried to match their energy, but his stomach was twisted in knots. The gallery opened at 6. By 5:30, people were already arriving. Students, faculty, parents, and most importantly, art world professionals. Daniel recognized several gallery owners from research he'd done online. There were also a few art critics, distinguished-looking people with expensive glasses and serious expressions. And then someone else walked in, someone Daniel hadn't expected to see. James Montgomery, director of the prestigious Westfield Gallery in the city. Montgomery was a legend in the contemporary art world. He'd discovered some of the biggest names of the past decade. What was he doing at a student exhibition at Riverside Academy? Daniel watched from across the room as Montgomery moved through the gallery, spending time at each piece. Professional, thorough, giving every student's work proper attention. When he reached Inheritance, he stopped, paused, leaned in closer. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photo of the placard next to the painting. The placard that included Daniel's name. Daniel's heart started racing. Montgomery stared at the painting for a long moment, then at his phone, then back at the painting. His expression changed from professional interest to something else. Recognition, surprise. Then Montgomery turned and started scanning the crowd, looking for someone. Daniel. His grandmother touched his arm. "Honey, that man is waving at you." James Montgomery was indeed waving at him, gesturing for Daniel to come over. On shaking legs, Daniel crossed the gallery. "Daniel Rodriguez Johnson?" Montgomery asked, his eyes bright with interest. "Yes, sir. I thought that might be you." Montgomery gestured at the painting. "This is your work?" "Yes, sir." "Remarkable, absolutely remarkable." Montgomery was smiling now, a huge, genuine smile. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir." "You're James Montgomery. You run the Westfield Gallery." "That's right. And do you know why?" "I'm here tonight?" Daniel shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I'm here because 2 years ago I attended a national youth art exhibition in Chicago. I saw a series of paintings there that absolutely blew me away. Bold, technically sophisticated, emotionally powerful work. The artist was a 17-year-old kid named Daniel Rodriguez Johnson, who'd won the National Youth Arts Achievement Award. The gallery seemed to go quiet around them, even though people were still talking. Daniel could see heads turning, people starting to pay attention to this conversation. "I tried to get in touch with you after that exhibition," Montgomery continued. "Left messages with the contact information on your award entry, but I never heard back. I figured you'd been snatched up by some other gallery or went off to school, and then tonight, I'm doing a favor for a friend on the faculty here, attending this student exhibition, and I see your name on a placard. Same name, same distinctive style. It's you, isn't it? The same artist?" "Yes, sir." Daniel's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Montgomery looked genuinely puzzled. Why didn't the school promote that one of their students is an award-winning artist who's already had work exhibited nationally? "I didn't think it mattered," Daniel said. "I wanted to learn. I wanted to be treated like any other student." "Well, you're not any other student." Montgomery turned back to the painting. "This work is exceptional. It's better than 90% of what I see from established artists. The technique is flawless and the conceptual depth is remarkable. You've grown tremendously since Chicago." By now a crowd had gathered. Students, faculty, parents, all listening to this conversation. Daniel could see Professor Martinez standing at the edge of the group, smiling, and beyond her, Professor Hartley, his face pale and frozen. "I'd like to talk to you about representation," Montgomery said. "The Westfield Gallery would be honored to showcase your work. We have a group exhibition coming up in August featuring emerging artists. Your painting here would be perfect for it." Daniel's grandmother made a sound that was half gasp, half squeal. "Baby, did you hear that? He wants to show your art in a real gallery." "Grandma, I've already been in galleries," Daniel said gently. "Remember the exhibition in Chicago? And that group show in Milwaukee?" "I know, but this is different. This is a famous gallery." She was practically bouncing with excitement. Montgomery chuckled. "Your grandmother is right to be excited. The Westfield Gallery has a reputation for launching careers. But honestly, Mrs. Johnson, your grandson's career was already launching. He just wasn't talking about it." Another voice cut through the crowd. "Mr. Montgomery, if I may." Professor Hartley pushed forward, his professional smile plastered on his face. "I'm Edward Hartley, Daniel's painting instructor. I'm delighted to see his work receiving such attention. We've worked very hard this semester on developing his technical skills and artistic voice." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. Was he really taking credit for this? Montgomery looked at Professor Hartley with polite interest. "Oh, what grade is Daniel receiving in your class?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Professor Hartley's smile faltered. "Well, that's between the student and instructor, of course, but Daniel has been progressing." "Progressing?" Maya's voice came from somewhere in the crowd. "Sir, you gave him a D on his last assignment." Several gasps rippled through the gathered people. Professor Martinez stepped forward. "Edward, perhaps this isn't the time or place." "No, I think it's exactly the time and place," Montgomery said, his voice cooling. "You're telling me that the artist who created this," he gestured at Inheritance, "a painting that demonstrates mastery of classical technique combined with contemporary vision, a painting that I would happily hang in my gallery right now, is failing your class?" Professor Hartley's face went from pale to red. "Mr. Montgomery, you don't understand the full context. Daniel has been resistant to instruction, unwilling to accept critique." "I've been nothing but respectful, sir," Daniel said quietly. "I've done every assignment. I've attended every class. I've applied every piece of technical feedback you've given me. See, this is exactly what I mean." Professor Hartley's voice rose. "This argumentative attitude, this refusal to accept that perhaps an experienced instructor knows better than a student." "An experienced instructor who didn't recognize an internationally recognized young artist in his own classroom," Professor Martinez interrupted. Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "An experienced instructor who gave failing grades to work that is objectively excellent." The dean of the College of Fine Arts, who Daniel hadn't even noticed arriving, stepped into the circle. Dean Patricia Morrison was a small woman with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "Edward, I think we should discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss," Professor Hartley said, his voice shaking with anger or embarrassment or both. "This is a witch hunt. I've maintained consistent standards in my classroom for nearly 30 years. If anyone has a problem with my teaching methods, 3 formal complaints in 5 years, Dean Morrison said quietly. All following the same pattern. All from students of color who, strangely, went on to have successful careers despite the poor grades you gave them. "Yes, Edward, we need to discuss this. In private." Now, Professor Hartley looked around at the crowd, seeming to realize for the first time how many people were watching this scene unfold. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the gallery. Dean Morrison followed, but not before giving Daniel an apologetic look. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Montgomery clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. "Well, that was uncomfortable. But let's refocus on what matters. This is a celebration of student artwork, and there's exceptional talent in this room. Daniel, we'll talk details later, but I'm serious about that August exhibition." People started talking again, the crowd dispersing back to viewing the artwork, but several people stopped by Daniel to congratulate him, to tell him his painting was stunning, to ask about his work. Word had spread through the gallery like wildfire. The National Youth Arts Achievement Award winner, the artist James Montgomery himself, wanted to represent. Trevor walked by without making eye contact, his face sullen. Ashley stopped to shake Daniel's hand, looking genuinely happy for him. Maya hugged him so hard he could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "And I'm so glad everyone finally knows." Daniel's mom had tears running down her face. "Baby, why didn't you tell us it was this bad? With your professor, I mean." "I didn't want you to worry," Daniel said. "And I thought maybe I was overreacting, or maybe I really was doing something wrong." "You weren't doing anything wrong," his grandmother said firmly. That man was trying to break your spirit. But look at you, still standing, still creating, still beautiful. Carlos, the other student Professor Hartley had targeted, came over and shook Daniel's hand. Man, thank you. You don't even know. Martinez told me she's reopening my grade appeals from last semester. Because of what happened with you, they're finally looking at the pattern. I didn't do anything, Daniel said. I just painted. You did more than that, Professor Martinez joined them. You stood your ground. You didn't let anyone diminish your work or your worth. That takes courage, especially for a first-year student. She smiled. For what it's worth, I pulled your admission portfolio this week. Your pre-college work is extraordinary. I don't know why you kept it quiet, but I understand wanting to be seen for who you are now, not who you were. That's admirable. Thank you, Daniel said. For everything. For believing me. I didn't have to believe you. The work speaks for itself. That's what art does when we let it. As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself standing in front of Inheritance, looking at it with new eyes. James Montgomery stood beside him. Can I ask you something? The gallery owner said. Of course, why this subject? Why this particular approach? Daniel thought about how to explain it. My whole life I've seen classical art in museums. Beautiful, technically perfect paintings of rich white people from centuries ago. And I always wondered, where are the rest of us? Where are the people who looked like me, painted with that same care and dignity and mastery? So I decided to paint it myself, to put us in that tradition, to say we've always been here, we've always mattered, we've always deserved to be seen. Montgomery nodded slowly. That's exactly what the art world needs right now. New voices using classical technique to tell stories that have been ignored for too long. You have a real gift, Daniel. Not just for painting, but for vision. Don't let anyone take that away from you. I won't, Daniel said. And he meant it. The exhibition continued for 2 more weeks. Daniel's painting received more attention than any other piece in the show. An art critic from a major newspaper wrote a glowing review that specifically called out Inheritance as work that transcends student status to stand alongside professional, contemporary art. Professor Hartley was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation into his grading practices. The dean's office announced that all his students from the past year would have their grades reviewed by an independent panel. And Daniel? He kept painting, kept learning, kept growing. Because that's what artists do. They create despite the obstacles, despite the people who try to stop them, despite everything.